All right.
All right. Um, so I guess unless people are rolling in a little late here, it might just be me and you. But I guess we can get started, and then if others join, we'll catch them up. But I I I would say that in a group setting, I would comment that I would want this to be an interactive session. But if it's a one-on-one conversation, clearly we have no other option. So I'll be relying on you to ask me questions and tell me what your interests are and tell me how I can help and what insights would be most useful. But to start out with, I'll give you a little bit of background about myself and my career and where I went, um, how I got to where I am. And then, I can talk about any number of things. I have a list of sort of prompt questions that might be helpful, but for the most part, I just want to, kind of hear about what your interests are, where you're headed, and how my career experiences, insights, and anything else can be useful for you. So, um, does that sound good to you?
Sounds great.
Great. So, my name is David, and I am currently in DC. I'm originally from Albany, New York. Grew up in upstate, and then went to college at Johns Hopkins, Baltimore. So I was a political science major in at Hopkins, and followed the natural draw to do a short commute down to DC for my summer internships and everything like that. And I know that there's a similar draw from UVA to DC. A lot of people do the DC thing from UVA as well. So uh, for me, it was a natural place for me to start looking for internships, particularly given my political science background in college. And so I interned on Capitol Hill in Congress, and then for a lobbying firm. And then I caught, when you do a little bit of work in DC, they say you'll either want to get out immediately or you'll catch Potomac fever. Um, and I'm not sure either happened to me. I just sort of continued to follow the path that I was on, but I would err more on the side of the latter, I guess. Because DC is a cool town, especially being from uh, small Albany, New York, as we like to affectionately call my hometown. So, so I got a job in DC working on the Senate side for a U.S. senator from Arizona. That was my first full-time job, and I started out answering the phones and helping constituents as they plan their trips to D.C. from Arizona, and kind of just got my feet wet in the political world with a senator who is a very senior senator. So I got a good name on my resume and worked my way up. I ended up working in uh, policy for him, doing like policy research on energy, environment, transportation, a couple other things. And then I got a job from there. I moved over to a congressman's office in the House of Representatives. So I went from the Senate side to the House of Representatives, where I was the policy advisor focused on energy, environment, and all those other things. So I was the one guy that was advising him on those policies. The bill came to the floor. Here's how you should vote. And so I did that for about 3 years, and then decided to go back to business school. I temporarily, at least, ended my public sector work to go back to business school because I wanted to. I went for business school and then got a job. So I interned at GE to follow like my energy work, and then I got a full-time job working for Boston Consulting Group, which is a management consulting firm, and I'm in the DC office of that firm. And since I've been at BCG for a little over a year now, I've been focusing in pharmaceuticals. So I've done a lot of work for pharmaceutical companies, um, helping them sort of like think about their strategy for like how to build their brand around a particular drug, and a couple other things. And then most recently and currently, I'm working on um, presidential transition and helping agencies and presidential candidates develop their plans for if they're elected, what do you do? And so that's my focus now. Happy to talk more about all of that, but that's just sort of like the rundown of where I've been. So I can touch on a lot of things. I can talk about the public sector and Congress and the federal government. I can talk about business school. I can talk about the private sector, pharmaceuticals, BCG, and a whole host of other things. So I'll stop there as an introduction, and then kind of hear. I'd love to hear an introduction from you and what you're interested in and what you're doing now.
Yeah, so we've touched on a little bit of it, but my name's Mary Boyd. It's actually a double name. It's an Atlanta thing. And I am from Atlanta, Georgia, and go to UVA. So I'm a sophomore, and I'm actually studying systems engineering and computer science. So what particularly struck me about your profile as an industry expert was the consulting side more than the politics side. I actually wish I were more politically informed than I were. So I have questions on that, but I'm definitely not a political science major by any means. But really interested in consulting because systems engineering involves a lot of optimization and looking at a process and seeing how to improve it, a lot of problem solving, those sorts of skills that are really relevant in the consulting industry. And so another thing I'm looking at is potentially maybe getting an MBA after graduation. And so all of those things sort of factor into your career path as well. So I'm interested to hear about them. But as far as that, really still trying to figure out what I do want to do with that and loving to hear about all sorts of different options and where you can take that, because I'm still unsure if I want to do engineering or if I want to take it into a consulting business world. And so I'm curious about how those things work, and coming from like a different background. For example, pharmaceuticals, you clearly didn't have a whole lot of background in that. So I'm interested to hear how sort of that worked and what that experience is like for you.
Okay. Before we get into all of that, let's throw in some interesting facts to spice it up a little bit.
Okay.
I'll throw in a couple things. So I am a space nerd. So anything space related. I still say when I grow up I'm going to be an astronaut. So that's still in the cards for me, I hope. And what else? I am a cocktail hobbyist. So I like making cocktails and have a home bar that I affectionately call my most prized possession. And when I was in high school, I was a semi-professional paintball player. So I'll throw those in there as a couple curveballs. I'd love to hear a couple things about you as well, and then we can get into the real meat.
Absolutely. So I actually guessed the first one because for a while when you were trying to figure out the recording, your screen came up and it was just a picture of the moon. So I got a little bit of a clue into that one.
Yeah, there you go.
But let's see. I am a runner. I really love to run, particularly long distances. You put me in for a 100 and I'm no Usain Bolt. I'll just die. But I actually trained for and ran a marathon this past spring. So that was a really fun thing for me to do. I'll run for forever. I just can't run fast. Other things about me, let's see. So definitely not a professional paintball player, but one of the things that I loved to do in high school was coupon. I'm not one of the TLC couponers, but I would just cut them out of my local paper and save a whole lot of money. And it's great now that I'm in college and paying for my own groceries. So would recommend that. And along those lines, I think my third thing is that I'm a huge foodie. My parents grew up taking us to restaurants and teaching us etiquette and that kind of thing. And so because of that, I love food, love to try new restaurants, and have eaten a lot of weird things, including, escargot, but also one time I ate kangaroo. So
like
bring it on.
Like the meat, because I've heard kangaroo tail is the delicacy.
I'm not totally sure. It was in burger form, actually. So you tell me what part of the kangaroo I was eating. I have no clue.
I've never had any of the above, so I will defer to you. You can eat all the kangaroo for me. How about that?
Sounds good.
Cool. So I usually like to start out with a couple of those because it makes it a little bit, you never know when there's sometimes there's interest in space, and I did space policy in Congress, so that's interesting.
Wow, that's so interesting.
A couple things that I'll start out sort of in response to some of your comments, and then we can kind of this will just be in conversation, like we can kind of go wherever it goes. But a couple things that you mentioned really stood out to me. So first of all, really cool that you're doing systems engineering. I know very little about it, but I do know that it's very impressive and very useful in the consulting world. From what I know about it, it's something that will provide you with the types of structured thinking that is required to be successful in consulting. I think engineering generally does that, but in particular, systems engineering, the optimization and thinking through problems and how do we make processes better, like those types of things are particularly useful in the consulting world. And I'll just give you an example. When you're interviewed for consulting, and you might already know this in your search. I don't know how far into the consulting, like recruiting and research that you've done, but when you're interviewed for a consulting job, you are essentially asked to do a case interview, which means we say, here's a business problem that our client is facing. What's the answer? And you have to like work through the case with the interviewer to get to an answer. And one of the main things that they're looking for when they interview you, for very good reason that I'll get to, is are you a structured thinker? So can you say right off the bat, I see that there are 3 issues that we need to address, or that could be the levers to solve the problem. The first is this, the second is this, the third is this. And you're thinking in a structured way, and you're thinking about how can we optimize the solution for the client. And so the reason they do that is because it's very much like when you're on the job, there are a million things that you could do. But if you're structured in your thinking, and if you understand how to put all of these pieces together into a discernible story and a discernible answer for the client, that's how you'll be successful as a consultant. So they test that early on. And from my understanding about systems engineering, is that that's something that would prepare you quite well for that. So that's a good thing. I guess I'll pause there. There were a couple other things that I heard that I have some thoughts on, but before I get to that, I want to talk about the MBA and everything else. But what are your thoughts and questions and everything else about consulting and the process, and how much do you know about it, and what can I answer?
So going into Modern Guild as a program, I really didn't know much about consulting at all, but I chose to be in the consulting accelerator just so that, I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Modern Guild structures, but essentially my coach is a consultant, and she's been putting me through case interviews and exercises that are relevant to consulting. So that's been really interesting to kind of get that level of insight. But as far as the MBA, essentially I'm trying to figure out, as I mentioned earlier, if I want to take it through like a traditional engineering path, looking at data, like taking the coding component, or if I want to go more into a business field. My dad actually worked for Bain, and so I'm sort of working off his experiences and seeing what that was like, and he went and got an MBA. But I've also heard some interesting things about the fact that an MBA may not be worth as much anymore, just because it's a set of skills that in many ways you can learn through actually working or through like teaching yourself in many cases. So I'm interested to hear your perspective on that. And also just sort of, I don't know, going through it, if you found consulting to be rewarding, or if you prefer the ability to specialize, because one thing I've noticed is that consultants kind of go in a wide variety of industries, and so I feel like that would be a little bit unstable.
Yeah, that's a very astute question. So let's talk about the MBA first, and then we can kind of get back to consulting, because it's almost like a stepwise process, at least for
Sure.
me and potentially for you. So the first thing I'll say about the MBA is, number one, I would very strongly encourage you to get a job right out of college and delay getting your MBA until at least 2, probably 3 or 4 years out of college. Traditionally, the top MBA programs don't even hire out of college. You can get hire. They don't even admit you right out of college. You can do, like, Duke has a Master of Management Studies, which is kind of like a mini MBA. But really that's for people who it's like people who want an extra year of business education out of undergrad, generally because like they couldn't quite get like the business job that they wanted directly out of undergrad. So like it's a great program for a very specific purpose, but I think that in the long term, a 1 year post undergrad degree is not as valuable. This is my opinion, but the MBA I think is very strongly gauged for people who are a few years into their career and are looking to do something either very specific and they know that they need an MBA to do that, or they're looking to transition and make a pivot into a different type of career traditionally into the private sector, though not always. So for me, it was a valuable, like I could never have done what I did. Like I could never have gotten a job at BCG just coming from the Hill ever. Like that just wouldn't happen. And so making the switch into the private sector was something that I definitely needed an MBA for. The other thing that I would encourage you when you're thinking about the MBA to think about it in terms of the quality of the network that it will build. So it's not just like with law school, like, yeah, you'll build a network, but really you're going to law school so that you could be a lawyer, you know? Med school, like, who knows if you even build any network because you're studying for so many hours, right? You're going to become a doctor. In business school, you're going to get 3 letters and a degree that doesn't actually qualify you for anything. But like there's no actual like qualification. Like you can't now do something that you couldn't do before in terms of like a formal definition. But it does build a base skill set, and it builds credibility and sort of like the entry that you need into certain industries. But for me, most importantly, like I was in one of my classmates' weddings. I'm gonna have one of them in mine. Like it's a network of friends, but also like business colleagues that you'll have for the rest of your life. That particularly as I build into the private sector career and in the public sector as well, you'll see how valuable that can be. So I would not write it off as just something that like, you know, oh, we don't get, like, I can't now become a doctor, you know, or something like that. Think of it in terms of what the value of the entire experience.
So I actually want to go back to something you said earlier when you were saying you couldn't have gotten the job at BCG directly off Capitol Hill. Can you kind of expand on that and explain what you meant there?
Yeah. So the top consulting firms have a few different like channels through which they hire and recruit. The primary channel has always been and is still from MBA for like the consultant level, which is what I am, and then from undergrad, like directly out of undergrad for the associate level. If you missed the boat on that associate recruiting out of undergrad, like I did, there are opportunities to get into consulting, but generally through like if you're a PhD and have like an interesting, like you're an astrophysics PhD and they want to be able to say with their like aerospace and defense clients, like, hey, we have this astrophysicist, you're going to put on your case. Or if you are like, they'll hire much more experienced professionals that can bring expertise. They have, 10 years of experience, 15 years of experience in an industry, and they understand how it works, and then they can go in and specify like their work in that industry. Me being 4 years out of college, I was an expert in nothing, and I did not have any sort of like interesting degree or anything that I could say, hey, like take a look at me. And I'm not saying it's impossible, but like pretty much everyone that you see at these firms are either right out of undergrad, or they're out of business school, or they have an advanced degree. And if they're not, then they're professionals that have been in the workforce for a number.
Gotcha. All right. So one of the things you said when you were talking about your timeline right at the end is that you're working on presidential transition plans. Do you mind explaining a little bit more what that exactly means?
Sure. So as you know, in consulting, you get staffed on a case. you are there for a period of time and then you move on to the next. So my current case, I am staffed on a pro bono project that BCG is working. We're working with a nonprofit called the Partnership for Public Service, and this is a nonprofit that since 2012, with the last presidential cycle, BCG and the partnership have been working together to codify a set of best practices around, like, when a new president takes office, it is the largest organizational change in the world because the federal government is a $4 trillion organization and it has hundreds of thousands of people working for it. And so, interestingly enough, there has never been an effort to like codify, here's what happens when a new president takes office. Pretty much what happens is a new president takes office and they say, oh crap, now what do we do? Literally, like very literally, that is exactly what happens. And so the partnership and BCG have been working for the past 4 years to help figure out, like, okay, how do we make this a better process? How do we make it more efficient? How do we empower whoever is the next president to execute on what he or she said he would do, he or she would do? And so for about a month, I was working on helping like federal agencies, for example, the Department of Defense or NASA or Department of Energy. I was helping them essentially saying like, hey, here are the best practices. Here are the things that you need to think about doing before the election to prepare for the transition, before the election and then before the new president's office. Here are the materials you need to develop. Here are the people you need to set up meetings with, et cetera. And now I am working with a presidential candidates organization, the transition organization. They basically set up like a group of people who are literally sitting there planning for what would happen if they get elected. And so I'm working on in one of the candidates organizations, helping them essentially develop the plans, helping them execute on like the preparation for the time period between the election and inauguration.
That's so interesting and kind of insane that they would not have, a clear transition plan already.
It's crazy.
That's codified. So I feel like a decent amount of that, though, you would need insight into kind of the president himself and what he went through in his transition. So I feel like it's unlikely that you're getting FaceTime with Obama regularly to sort of talk about that. So how do you go about kind of getting that kinds of insight?
So think about it, there are like there are 3 stakeholders right now. The one stakeholder is the current federal government, so President Obama's agencies, and they will be sort of outgoing. And so we're sitting with them saying like, hey, pretty soon you're not going to be sitting here. What do you need to do to be able to hand it off to the next one? And it's not like we need to sit with the president. Those are kind of like sitting with senior leaders in NASA. So like essentially the person below the administrator of NASA is like one of the people that I met with. And so helping them figure out like what are their plans. And then on the other side of it, you have the other stakeholders, which are Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump.
Right.
And one of them is going to win in November. One of them is going to take office in January. And so BCG is working with both candidates to say, like, not like sitting with the candidates themselves, because frankly, they're focused on winning the election, not like what happens when they do. What the candidates do is they say, hey, designee X, which in Donald Trump's case is Chris Christie, the governor of New Jersey, and with Hillary Clinton is another governor. And so basically say, hey, you guys think about the transition. I'm going to be focusing on winning the election. You set up the plans for what happens when I do. And so we're working with that organization that's being created sort of off to the side to say like, hey, here are all the things that you guys got to do to like prepare for one of you winning the election.
So do you think it's helpful in doing this now to have that background, having worked for several congressmen and senators going through?
Yeah, and that was what you'll find in consulting is you mentioned having no background in pharma and being placed in pharma, and we could talk about that a little bit too. There are sometimes where that happens, where you have no background and they're just like, well, we're just putting you figure it out. And then there are other times like this where my experience, directly correlated with what they needed, which was someone who has like the private sector business like mindset and MBA, paired with like an understanding of how the federal government works, what all the federal agencies are, and like, just kind of like understands the lingo. And so for me, I kind of raised my hand saying like, hey, this sounds really cool, I want to do this. And then just worked out because I had a relevant background.
So how much power do you have in figuring out where you're going to be assigned to cases, or it's just because you were saying, oh, like, pick me, like, were you able to actually do that, or you just kind of emphasize to your boss, oh, I have these relevant skills, or what does that look like?
Yeah. So it varies, and so it varies by firm, it varies by office, but my experience has been that it's a combination of, so there's like a staffing organization at these, there's like a group of people who are responsible for like figuring out where to put you. And that organization in some firms has like complete say over where you get staffed. In other places, they're more like administrative in terms of like a partner that you're friends with or that you've built a relationship with tells staffing that they want you staffed, and they say okay. So there's some variation. For me, the very first case, and I think traditionally, like the very first case you get staffed on, you have no control over. Like, here's your case. And for me, that was pharma, which I had no experience in. And I was like, what doesn't make sense. But it turned out to be a super cool case. I actually did a brand strategy case, figuring out how a new jet lag drug or potential jet lag drug could enter the market and like this. So I had no control over that, but it turned out pretty well. And then from then on, you have sort of a growing amount of control, where like my second case, I still was pretty much told like, you're going to do this. But then you start to build relationships with people at the firm, with partners, with principals, with some of the senior people who are staffing cases. And there was one instance where the staffing group was saying, hey, here's a case that would be great for you. And it looked terrible. And I was like, So I called one of the principals who I had worked with on the jet lag case. Said, hey, like, what do you have going on? Do you have anything you're staffing up? And she was like, yes, we actually have a perfect brand strategy case. It's very similar to what we did before. I would love to have you on since you did a good job in the first one. So she then called staffing and said, hey, I want to staff David on this case. And they're like, oh, okay, cool. And that was it. So if you do well and you build good relationships, you can increase the amount of impact or say that you have in the staffing.
Gotcha. So when you were just kind of thrown into pharma, how did you go about dealing with that learning curve and sort of catching up in that area? And also, I would just love to hear about the experience and what it means to go through brand strategy and what sorts of things y'all ended up looking at in order to work on that.
You ask very good questions. So, yeah. What was the first one? You asked two.
First one was getting thrown in and learning curve.
Yeah. So I think of it a little bit like every semester you're taking a new class, and you've probably, maybe it's, like exclude, systems engineering 201, where you've done 101 and you can whatever. For the most part, like when you take a new class, you may or may not have any background in it. And you might have some skills that can apply, but like you're learning something. I think of consulting cases very much the same way. And regardless of whether or not you know the industry or not, every new case is completely different. Like everything is different. And you might have done brand strategy before and you could say like, okay, I know we need to do 1, 2, 3, 4 things, but like you have to completely relearn everything based on the context of the client, the context of the drug or whatever. So for me, I think that the learning curve in terms of getting up to speed on pharma was really no greater. I mean, like marginally greater than doing the second or third or fourth case. I think the biggest learning curve is just getting the lingo. like you're going to have that in any industry, in any like nuanced like niche that you're working in. And once you kind of pick up, like once you're there for like 2 months, you got the lingo down, and it's more about figuring out like what's the answer to the problem. And the reason that you got hired is because you're a problem solver, and that's what consulting firms look for. So for me, I think it was very much a matter of like, okay, I'm working with a team that's worked in pharma before, so I can leverage them. BCG and all these top firms have like a ton of resources on like Pharma 101. Like you literally have learning modules that you can click and say like, what are pharmaceuticals? Like, what is a drug? Like, just like the basics that you can pick up. And then we have also like research resources that you can say like, hey, I need information on like the last 5 years of sales of like all the drugs, and just reading up on stuff like that. So you have at any firm like this, you'll have the resources you need to learn. And I think that I was less, looking back, it was less of a learning curve than I had expected.
Gotcha. And then the second question was just sort of asking about the idea of brand strategy as a whole, and what sorts of things went into that, and then what did your product as the consultants look like for them? So what sorts of services specifically were you providing them in relation to their brand?
So I think the jet lag one is a good one. So I've also done work on schizophrenia. I've done work on gout. It kind of touched a number of weird different drug and diseases. But let's talk about the jet lag one, because I don't know if you have schizophrenia or gout, but I'm assuming you don't. So
not yet.
Yeah, unless you're like a 45-year-old man that drinks every day and eats a lot of meat, probably. But so the jet lag case was interesting. Think about brand strategy in terms of like what does the brand, what are all of the levers that we need to pull to increase sales for the brand, or in this case, like to start, like because the drug was not, and actually still currently is not yet quite available. So like what are the things that we need to do in preparation for entering the market? And that includes surveying physicians and saying like, hey, like what are the things that you think about when you prescribe drugs for jet lag? Which actually in this case, like there really aren't drugs for jet lag yet. But like what are the things that like you prioritize when advising your patients on like what to do for jet lag? So we take that information. You'll survey potential patients, so like frequent business travelers. We actually called a lot of BCGers and said like, what are the things that bother you most about jet lag, and what would you be willing to take a drug that does XYZ, and when would you take it, and how much would you pay, and things. And you fold all that in and you say, okay, here are the types of patients that would use this drug. Here's when they would use it. Here's how often they would. Here's how much they would pay. Here are the messages that would resonate most with them. And here's how you should position this drug when you enter the market. Do you highlight that it, helps you perform at your best, or do you highlight that it, you can party all night, or like what are all the different ways that you message it? And then like on the other side of things, there's like, how do you make sure that insurance companies cover it, and stuff like that are more like specific. But I think the most interesting part is like, who's going to buy it? Why are they going to buy it? And how do we make sure that we tell them the things that they need to know in order to buy it?
So just out of curiosity, what's going to make people buy jet lag drugs?
It is primarily going to be people who are very senior and are willing to pay for a drug that is marginally better than what's on the market, so that when they're feeling a multi-million-dollar deal, they're at their top game. That's like,
wow, it's a niche.
It's like a niche area, but it's an area that I think a lot of people are just like, oh, whatever, I'll just sleep on a plane, or I'll just drink booze on a plane.
Right.
It's an education that would need to happen.
So one thing I'm interested by is that whenever I read about pharma these days, I keep hearing about just the price increases and how much the prices of drugs have gone up and how there's so much pushback. And and how insurance companies are dealing with that. So I'm curious about how those sort of conflicts and also all the changes going on in the healthcare industry as a result of both like the Affordable Care Act and just the potential that that might change in this upcoming election. Were any of those factors that y'all were looking at, or you were really focused specifically on the consumer side?
Yeah, I think I didn't look like specifically at like how is the Affordable Care Act going to change or like how is it going to affect it. I think I think the industry itself is in a state of change at the moment, given Obamacare and given the negative press and like a bunch of people doing really stupid things in terms of like price increases and stuff like you're like really like you're making the whole industry look bad, right? So what you'll see is a general uncertainty in the industry, and I think what you'll learn over time in business is that uncertainty is a very bad thing for business because you don't know. It's like it's a lot easier if you could say like the economy sucks and we have to fire people. It makes it easier to make a decision than saying like we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how to plan for it. Like we don't know if we should cut jobs. We don't know if we should grow jobs. We don't know if we should enter this new market or invest in this new drug. So there's just a lot of uncertainty, I think. And how do we show that we're not like bad human beings in that industry? And like working in the industry, you can see there are definitely problems and there are definitely times where we're like do things differently. But when at the end of the day you get to work on drugs and brand strategy and you think like, okay, yeah, people have to pay a lot to do this, but that money that they're paying is funding the development of the drugs that are going to cure cancer, of the drugs that are going to cure Alzheimer's, of the things that are going to save people's lives in the future. So it's like, yeah, like you're paying a lot for a jet lag drug, but like that money isn't just like lining the pockets of rich executives. It's actually being used for good. And it's just hard to tell that story. And I think that the industry is trying to figure out better ways to like not look like total jerks.
Gotcha. That's an interesting point because I'd never thought of it in that way, that money is going back to help produce more drugs. So that's interesting. I didn't think about that.
The story doesn't get told very often because it's a lot easier to say like these rich,
Yeah. Price increases, accuse them. Yeah. So going back to your career in politics, a couple of things you mentioned in your introduction stuck with me that I haven't asked about yet. So one was how you transitioned over from, I believe, someone working in the Senate to the House of Representatives, or maybe it was the other way around. But you kind of seemed to indicate that was a kind of a bigger switch than I might have expected. Is that true? And if so, why was that?
So by bigger switch, do you mean like level of responsibility
Or I just thought it was interesting that in your introduction you highlighted, like that was a change. And so I'm wondering how like your role was different and how it's different working with people who are there for longer or shorter terms and like, again, bigger numbers of people. So how that impacts your role as someone who's helping them make policy decisions and what that looks like, I guess.
Yeah, sure. So I started on the Senate side and then moved to the House side.
Okay.
The Senate, especially, so the Senate, generally speaking, you're representing more people. The senators have probably been there longer. They have more power because there are 100 of them and 435 congressmen. So the level of advisory roles is much higher. So the people who are what's called legislative assistants, like essentially like the policy advisors to the senators, are older. They've been there a while. They're experts in their fields. I was, like I said, answering phones and then doing research on policy issues to support a couple of those legislative assistants who would directly advise them. On the House side, on the other hand, you have an office of like truly like 6 or 7 people doing everything for the congressman. And the House side is where very, very, very young people with absolutely no expertise are advising the congressman on big policy issues. So like I was 23 when I started advising the congressman, I was like the one person saying like, on this energy bill, vote yes or no. And like I wrote his bill, I wrote the bills and amendments, I wrote legislation that got signed into law, and I was like super young. So like the House side is very much where at a young age you can do a lot of like really cool stuff and have like a lot of like interesting responsibilities. But you know the power that the person has who you're working for is much less. So like you can make differences like kind of on the margins, whereas you can make like you can have a big say over like a little pie kind of thing. Whereas like on the Senate side, you can have a little say on like a big pie of influence, right? So it's kind of like a little bit of a different experience. But you know, when you're working in a staff of 7 people, like I know the congressman super well, and you're spending like all day with him, and um, you know, it's a neat experience to. So there are positives and negatives, and the experiences are a little bit different. But for me, it was definitely like really cool to come out of a few years on the Hill and say like, yeah, I have like 4 amendments that were signed by the president to be law. So like, pretty neat.
That is awesome. Does that ever, so did you ever feel, I guess, scared or unsure in that position? I feel like, what is that, 4 years from now for me? And if I was just thrown in and being the one making the decisions on what a representative votes on energy, that's an enormous amount of responsibility. Was that scary? Did that give you confidence in the system, or like having met
Yeah,
people
like,
there?
oh
I don't
God,
know.
this is how our government's run. This is terrible.
Yeah. Like, do you feel like that is effective? And I don't know. I'm curious.
It's a really good question. The House side especially is run by it's run by young, like the people really making the decisions, like the big decisions, have been there forever. You know, they're on a committee, and they've been an attorney on the committee for 30 years, and they're like writing the big stuff. Like they're the ones that are like actually doing the important things. Like Obamacare was not created by a 23-year-old, right? Like
Sure.
but the the little things are definitely like on the margins, places where you can have an impact. And what I would say is, you know, for me, like yeah, it's a little bit. I think the daunting aspects of it are when like I would essentially like I would hold many meetings that the congressman couldn't be in, and frankly like didn't have time for, that I was representing him. And I was 23, meeting with executives, senior executives of like energy companies or like trucking companies or things like that, with like executives that have been there for like 30 years and like know the industry inside and out. And I'm like, wait, what's that word that you mentioned? Like I don't. So like that's the daunting side of it. But when you're actually making the decisions, making the calls, and like writing the legislation, you have like it all is working in coordination with the people who care about it. So like you're working with those executives saying like, hey, like here's this idea, like what do you think, how would this affect you? And like you get, it's sort of like this process where you're just bringing in a bunch of information and you're honing it into something that you think is like, hey boss, like here's what I think you should do. So it's not like you're expected at 23 to come up with all the ideas that like one would do in energy policy. Like you're just essentially synthesizing a bunch of viewpoints and like narrowing it into something that the boss could support.
Sure. That's so cool and really interesting. Now that you had that experience in the public sector and getting to be so hands-on and involved in that, and now you're in the private sector and still working in politics, but like, do you like that you've made the transition? Would you ever want to go back to public sector work?
So I very much like where I'm at BCG for now. It's you learn so fast in consulting, like so fast. Like looking back and seeing where I was a year ago when I started is unbelievable. How far I've come. And so I think that for now, the private sector and particularly is where I want to stay, just because, you know, like I said, I want to be an astronaut when I grow up, and I'm not sure yet how I'm going to get there. So like, it keeps the doors open. One of the things that you mentioned was at the beginning was the generalist model versus like specifying early on. We could talk about that a little bit if it interests you, but for me, it's something that, you know, I'm still open to ideas and industries and functions the BCG is a good place for that. The public sector, I think I'll probably for a while in my career walk this line between the private and public sector, because the private sector, at the end of every day, you can say like, I accomplished this today, and like it increased sales by X%, and like we accomplished. In the public sector, you can say we moved about 1 yard down the football field of like changing the country. And I can't really say like how much my work contributed to that 1 yard of growth, but like it's a big issue, right? So like the public sector, you get to work on like big issues and like have like a little bit of an impact that you like slowly but surely make progress together on. And the private sector is much more like, we did this, it accomplished this. So you can see the impact of your work. So I'll probably be kind of, I don't know, weaving in and out of those spaces for the time being.
Where do you think space, like what do you think are the next steps in space? Where are we going to see ourselves in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years? Should I expect my kids to take trips to Mars? Where are we looking?
Depends on who's president, first of all.
Really?
Yeah. And it also, I think, depends on how much we actually realize that we do and should care. So like the times where we actually did anything interesting in space were driven by a national security interest, where like we need to get to the moon first because the Soviet Union is like our competitor, and we're, you know, essentially like we're scared of what right? So like we don't really have that same drive anymore, which makes me a little bit concerned that like the aggressive estimates for when we'll actually have like a human walk on the moon are frankly like 2030, which is like ludicrous to me that we got to the much shorter period. But I would think in our lifetime we'll see someone walk on the moon. I just don't know if I'll be an old man at that time, or if I'm sorry, on Mars. I just don't know if I'll be an old man at that time, or like still a reasonable age.
Can you go back to the comment about the president? I am not familiar with space policies for sure. So what do you think the difference would be there?
It's the space is very much like a budget issue. And,
right.
Neither candidate has said much about NASA. Donald Trump, I think, would be less inclined to fund it, just because of like his, I think, general outlook on budget issues. So, you know, that's to be determined. I would also say that this is me opining. We don't need to get into this in too much detail. I would also say that I'm very disappointed in President Obama's like funding of like handling of NASA, because while he's someone who would fund it, he doesn't. I don't think he managed the organization. So it's not just a party thing. It's I think very much like, does the person in the job drive it to actually like do impressive?
So then what do you think about SpaceX and Blue Origin and all of these sort of private groups that are kind of coming at it, also looking at space and moving forward? Do you think that's the future, or do you think that it's still going to be NASA moving us forward into space in the future?
I love the private space industry. It's actually an industry I consider trying to get into, but for a few reasons did not really pursue. But SpaceX and others, I love what they're doing. I hope they're successful. It's a huge challenge. It costs a lot of money. You know, the quote that Elon Musk stole from Richard Branson. Elon Musk is the guy that started SpaceX, one of the principal investors. He stole a quote from Richard Branson, who started Virgin America and Virgin, like all of the Virgin brands. Richard Branson originally said this, and then Elon Musk said, the best way to become a millionaire is to be a billionaire and start a space company. And so like it's a really, really, really hard industry. I hope that they're successful, because I think that they can take some of the funding pressures off of NASA for some important things. I think no private company is going to get us to Mars. It's got to be a public. It costs too much money. There's no private reason. There's not enough money to be made to justify hundreds of billions of dollars in expense, and where that money would come from, I don't know. So that's got to be a public effort.
Sure. Yeah. Just keep cranking out Teslas and then maybe get us to Mars one day, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh man.
So what else are you mentioned, consulting as like a career interest. Like where are you in terms of the whole wide variety of things that you're considering? Because you're only a sophomore or a rising sophomore, and the world is at your fingertips. So what else do you think?
Honestly, it's kind of a thing where I have so many options that I'm not looking at any of them at all. Or, it's so many that I can't focus in, and there are just a million. You can take any industry and they're going to be doing data analytics, they're going to be doing optimization of their processes. And so I am just really unsure of where I want to take that. So consulting is like really appealing because it's very structured. Like I know a lot of people who've gotten into it and it seems very interesting. Like you said, you learn so much in such a short period of time, and that's really cool to me. But I could also take it and do logistics for pretty much any firm that's delivering a product to consumers, which most of them are. So looking at that, and then I'm also minoring in computer science. So then I could also be interested in software development and the intersection of those things. But I have no idea. Yeah. That is the honest truth, is that I am very much still figuring it out. So hopefully we'll have some sort of insights, maybe do some shadowing of jobs in the next year or so, and get a better sense of what I want going forward.
One thing I would say that, if I were to look back at my career, one of the things that I would probably do different is, number one, I would probably get an engineering degree. So I think what you're doing is great. The way that, what you'll find, and this may or may not, you may just decide like, I don't want to do engineering, right? Like if that's the case, that's fine. But good news is, number one, you're going to get an engineering degree, which automatically qualifies you for things, even if you don't do engineering. Like there are jobs that I just, like Tesla is a great example. When I went to business school, I contacted a bunch of people at Tesla, and like they were pretty much like, it's not that it's impossible for you to get a job here, but if you're not an engineer, it's going to be really hard. And that's just because Elon Musk, like, he's an engineer and he hires engineers. So, and there are a lot of places that like are very, very much like want to have that. So, it's great that you're getting that degree. The other thing that I would say is, you can always make not always, but like you can make the transition into consulting or into a sort quote unquote softer field from engineering. So you can always go from an engineering job and say, you know what, I want to do consulting now. I don't like what I've been doing, or even just like, I want to try something new. So you can always go from engineering to consulting, or like getting an MBA and then getting into consulting, or like doing something else. It's much harder to go the other way. So like if I wanted to do engineering now, I would literally have to go back and get another bachelor's degree.
Right.
And that will never I won't do that. So one thought for you is to think about, like, I think it actually keeps more doors open for you to do engineering out of undergrad and test it out, see if you like it, see if you like the industry, see if you like even just doing engineering like jobs on a daily basis. And then you have the option to go into consulting. I think it would be harder for you, since I'm not an engineer, I don't know this for a fact. I think it would be harder for you to go into consulting out of undergrad and then become an engineer by trade. Just because a lot of those jobs, like if you're in consulting for 3 years, like you'll probably have to like go back to an entry level. A lot of that type of thing would they be looking for people with more experience to take a more job.
Yeah,
that is a thought. That is my humble opinion, but
that makes a lot of sense. And again, was something I hadn't fully thought about. So I appreciate that. I'm going to think about that. But just in general, thank you so much for your time and for answering all of my questions, including ones that were just like, I have no idea what this is. So this has been so interesting. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. And I don't know what the like sort of follow-up of all of this is, but feel free to reach out to the folks at Modern Guild for my contact. Happy to keep in touch and answer any questions and help you as you're going on and figuring your path out.
All right. Well, thanks so much, and best wishes on the astronaut plan. Would love to see pictures of you on Mars anytime soon.
Yeah, someday. All right. Thanks, Mary Boyd.
All right. See ya.